In the American frontier, winter was not a season, it was a verdict. Long before weather reports, insulation ratings, or modern building codes, winter was the one force that never lied. It didn't care how confident you were, how experienced you claimed to be, or how many cabins you had built before. When the temperature dropped and stayed there, winter stripped away excuses and exposed mistakes. Quietly, relentlessly. In the northern Rockies of the late 1800s, a man didn't prove himself with words. He proved himself by whether his family woke up warm in the morning. Most settlers understood this in theory. They stockpiled firewood. They built big cabins with high ceilings and wide rooms. They believed space meant comfort and big fires meant safety. On paper, it made sense. More room to move, more light, more air. That was the American instinct: build bigger, build, fast build with confidence. But winter never cared about confidence. When cold settles in for months, when nights stretch to 16 hours, when wood piles shrink faster than muscle can cut, them size becomes a liability. Heat doesn't ask how proud you are of your home. It escapes through every crack, every window, every inch of exposed surface. And once it's gone, no amount of bravado brings it back. Frontier cemeteries are filled with men who learned that lesson too late. This story begins in a place where that truth was about to be tested harder than ever before. Montana Territory, early 1880s. A land still young, still rough, still confident enough to believe it had already figured things out. Winters here were known to be harsh, but what most settlers didn't yet understand was how brutal they could become when cold stopped coming in waves and started arriving as a siege. This is not a story about comfort. It's a story about design choices that decide whether you endure or suffer. Because on the frontier, winter doesn't reward effort, it rewards understanding. And in the winter that followed, one small, unimpressive cabin would expose a mistake almost everyone else had made, one that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with how heat actually works. Winter was coming, and it was about to judge everyone equally. Most frontier cabins were built on an idea that felt obvious: bigger meant better. Settlers arriving in the northern territories carried the same assumptions they had grown up with back east. A proper home had space, it had height, it had windows wide enough to flood the room with daylight. If it felt open and breathable, it felt right. That logic shaped almost every cabin built in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming during the late 19th century. The standard cabin followed a familiar formula: a large rectangular footprint, single-layer log walls packed with clay or mud chinking, a central fireplace big enough to swallow logs by the armload, high ceilings to let smoke rise and escape, windows placed generously because sunlight was seen as health, morale, and civilization itself. And for mild winters, it worked well enough. But deep winter doesn't care about tradition, it cares about physics. The mistake wasn't poor craftsmanship. Many of these cabins were built by skilled men. The mistake was misunderstanding heat. Settlers focused on how much heat they could produce, not how much heat they could keep. Firewood was plentiful in the fall, so waste went unnoticed. Logs burned bright, chimneys pulled strong. Flames made people feel safe until January arrived. Heat always moves toward cold. The larger the space, the more surface area heat can escape through. Every window became a leak. Every tall wall became a loss. High ceilings trapped warm air where no one lived, while cold pooled at floor level where people slept. Fires worked non-stop, but the cabin never truly warmed. It only fought back for a few hours at a time. The solution settlers reached for was always the same: bigger fires, more wood, longer nights feeding the flames. That approach came at a cost: exhaustion, injuries from overcutting, wood piles that vanished weeks before spring, families waking every 2 hours to keep the fire alive because letting it die meant waking up freezing. This was the American cabin assumption. If you're cold, you don't change the building, you burn more fuel. What most settlers didn't realize yet was that winter punishes inefficiency harder than weakness, and no amount of hard work can overcome a structure that bleeds heat faster than fire can replace it. That blind spot was about to be exposed, because one man on the frontier wasn't asking how big a cabin should be. He was asking a different question entirely. How little heat do you actually need if you stop wasting it? The man who questioned those assumptions did not look like a revolutionary. He arrived without ceremony, no reputation, no claims of superior knowledge, just a quiet confidence that came from having seen cold behave in ways most Americans had not. He was shaped by winters that didn't test comfort but survival itself. Winters where mistakes didn't lead to discomfort but to death. Where he came from, winter wasn't something you endured with effort alone. It was something you planned for years in advance. In the mountain regions of northern Europe, cold lasted longer than it did in Montana. Darkness stayed for months. Firewood was never abundant. Cutting more was not an option once snow closed the passes. Families survived not by burning hotter, but by holding on to what little heat they could produce. That environment trained a different way of thinking. Instead of asking how large a home could be, builders asked how small it could remain functional. Instead of focusing on flames, they focused on what happened after the fire went out. Warmth was treated like a stored resource, not a temporary sensation. Walls were expected to work just as hard as the stove. The man carried those lessons with him not as theory but as memory. He had seen homes that stayed warm long after the fire died. He had seen stone and earth used as tools, not decorations. He had watched elders reject wide windows and tall ceilings because beauty meant nothing if cold crept in by midnight. What stood out was not that these methods were clever. It was that they were unforgiving. There was no room for waste, no tolerance for excess. Every design choice had to earn its place. When he looked at American frontier cabins, he didn't see strength. He saw risk. Large spaces that demanded constant feeding, thin walls that surrendered heat without resistance, fireplaces that sent warmth straight into the sky while people shivered beside them. Most settlers had never lived through a winter where wood ran out before spring. He had. Most had never watched a fire fail. He had. So, when it came time to build his own shelter, he wasn't interested in proving a point. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was building the way you build, when you assume winter will win unless you design for it. That mindset made him look stubborn, small-minded, even foolish. But it came from a place deeper than pride. It came from knowing that cold doesn't negotiate and that survival favors those who prepare quietly, not loudly. On the frontier, people blamed cold on size in the wrong way. They believed small cabins were colder because they felt cramped, dark, tight. They assumed discomfort meant danger. If a space felt confined, it must be harder to live in. That belief was emotional, not technical, and winter doesn't respond to feelings. The truth is, simple heat doesn't care how cozy a room looks. It cares about surface area. Every wall is a place where heat escapes. Every ceiling is a leak. Every window is a weak point. The larger the structure, the more opportunities heat has to leave. A big cabin isn't just harder to heat, it's constantly working against itself. A small cabin flips that equation. With less volume, there's less air to warm. With fewer exterior surfaces, there's less heat loss. When walls are close together, warmth doesn't drift away. It stays where people live, sleep, and breathe. Heat becomes concentrated instead of diluted. This isn't theory. It's been proven over and over again in places where survival mattered more than comfort. Caves stay warm in winter not because they're heated, but because they're insulated by mass. Root cellars don't freeze because the earth buffers temperature changes. Submarines, bunkers, and mountain shelters all rely on the same principle: minimize exposed surface. maximize thermal stability. Frontier settlers often made the opposite choice. They built upward instead of inward. They chased light and space, thinking those qualities meant health. But every extra foot of wall created more work for the fire. Every tall ceiling stored warm air where no one could reach it. Small cabins weren't the problem. Thin cabins were. A compact space wrapped in dense material behaves differently. It resists temperature swings. It holds on to warmth instead of losing it in minutes. Fire stops being a constant emergency and becomes a controlled tool. The man building that small cabin understood this instinctively. He wasn't shrinking his home to punish himself. He was shrinking the battle winter could fight. On the frontier, survival isn't about how much you can endure. It's about how little you force yourself to endure in the first place. And in that equation, small wasn't weakness. It was leverage. Most settlers saw stone as dead weight. They used it for foundations, chimneys, and little else. Stone was heavy, slow to work with, and unforgiving if you made a mistake. Wood was faster. Wood was familiar. Wood burned, and burning felt like warmth. Stone, by comparison, seemed cold and useless. That misunderstanding cost people dearly. Stone does not create heat. That much is true. But it does something far more important. In a brutal winter, it holds heat. And holding heat is what keeps people alive when the fire goes out. This is where frontier thinking fell behind physics. A roaring fire produces heat fast, but fast heat is unstable. The moment the fire weakens, the temperature drops. Most American fireplaces sent the majority of that heat straight up the chimney. You could feel warm standing near the flames, but the building itself stayed cold. Once the fire died, so did the warmth. Stone changes that behavior completely. Dense materials like limestone, sandstone, and packed earth absorb heat slowly. They don't spike in temperature. They store energy quietly. And once they're warm, they release that heat back into the space over many hours. This process is called thermal mass, but you don't need the term to understand the result. It means the walls work while you sleep. Instead of chasing warmth with constant fires, stone turns a short burn into long comfort. The heat spreads evenly. No hot spots, no freezing corners. The room stays stable instead of swinging between too hot and too cold. Old cultures understood this because they had no choice. In places where fuel was scarce, burning non-stop was impossible. Homes were built to cooperate with heat, not waste it. Fire became a way to charge the structure, not fight the weather directly. On the American frontier, fuel seemed endless until it wasn't. Most settlers never measured how much heat they lost. They only noticed how much wood they burned. Stone looked inefficient because it took time to warm up. But that delay was the entire point. Once charged, it paid back every hour after the fire died. The man building that small cabin wasn't stacking stone for strength. He was building a battery. And winter was about to prove how powerful that battery really was. Most cabins on the frontier were built to look right, not to work right. Settlers chose sites for convenience or views. Flat ground, open clearings, easy access. Cabins were squared to property lines or trails, not to weather. Walls were raised straight and tall, as if winter would be polite enough to arrive evenly from all directions. It never did. Wind is winter's real weapon. Cold air doesn't just sit outside a cabin, it hunts for openings. It pushes against walls, forces itself through seams, and strips heat away faster than fire can replace it. A well-fed fire means nothing if the wind is pulling warmth out faster than you can make it. The man building the small cabin paid attention to that first. He didn't center the structure in the clearing. He tucked it slightly into the land. He reduced the surfaces the wind could strike directly. The longest wall faced away from prevailing winter winds. Corners were reinforced because corners lose heat faster than flat walls. Nothing about the placement was accidental. Height was kept low on purpose. Warm air rises and tall ceilings store heat where no one can use it. A lower roofline meant warmth stayed at living level. It also reduced wind pressure against the structure. Less exposed surface meant fewer losses. Windows were treated as liabilities, not luxuries. They were small, positioned for light without creating drafts. Glass was precious, but so was heat. Every opening was a trade-off, and light was never allowed to cost warmth. The door mattered just as much. It wasn't a thin plank hung on hinges. It was layered, heavy, designed to slow air movement. Cold sneaks in through doors more than walls, and frontier builders often ignored that. The roof wasn't built for speed. It was built for insulation. Thick layers, tight seams, no wasted height. Snow piling on top wasn't a problem. It added insulation. Weight was expected. Strength was built in. This cabin wasn't fighting winter head-on. It was sidestepping it. Instead of trying to overpower the cold with constant fire, it reduced how much cold could attack in the first place. That difference matters more than any stove ever could. Winter doesn't care how hard you work. It cares how smart you place each board, stone, and opening. And this cabin was built to face winter on its terms, not on traditions. Ridicule came easily on the frontier. It always does when something breaks from habit. Experienced builders walked past the small cabin and shook their heads. Men who had survived years of hard winters felt confident in their judgment. They had built bigger, brighter, faster. Their cabins looked like progress. What stood in front of them now looked like retreat. Too small, too dark, too heavy with stone. They said it openly. At the store, on the trail, in passing. Jokes were made without malice but with certainty. Certainty is what people lean on when they don't feel the need to question themselves. The criticism followed a pattern. Stone was called wasteful. Thick walls were labeled ignorant. Narrow windows were blamed for sickness and low spirits. A small firebox was dismissed as dangerous. Everyone knew you needed volume and flame to survive a real winter. They weren't cruel, they were convinced. That's what made it dangerous. On the frontier, experience carried authority. If a man had built dozens of cabins and lived through several winters, his opinion mattered. When those men spoke, younger settlers listened. Consensus formed quickly, and once it did, it hardened. No one bothered to measure anything. No one asked what happened after the fire went out. No one tested how long warmth lasted in the walls. They judged by appearance and habit, and appearance said this cabin was wrong. The builder didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain physics or lecture about old-world methods. He kept working. That silence made people more confident in their criticism. Silence is often mistaken for weakness. Some settlers felt concern. They expected to be helping a desperate man by winter's end. Others enjoyed the spectacle. On the frontier, difference often becomes entertainment when danger hasn't arrived yet. The laughter wasn't personal. It was cultural. It came from a shared belief that frontier knowledge had already peaked, that newer meant better, that old techniques were obsolete, that survival was about toughness, not restraint. But winter doesn't care how many people agree with you. And when cold finally arrived in force, laughter would be the first thing to disappear. The real test didn't begin with the first snowfall. It began when the cold stopped leaving. Early winter is manageable. Fires burn, spirits stay high. Wood piles still look generous. Cold feels temporary, like something you outlast through effort. That illusion holds right up until the temperature drops and refuses to rise again. When the deep freeze settled in, priorities shifted fast. Wood stopped being fuel and became currency. Every log burned was a calculation. Every armload carried inside was a reminder that the pile outside was shrinking. Men woke in the night not because they were rested, but because the fire demanded it. Sleep broke into short fragments between feedings. Mistakes started happening during the day. Axes slipped, saws bit too deep, tempers shortened. This is how winter actually breaks people, not all at once, but slowly. Large cabins suffered first. Big rooms demanded constant heat. Fires burned hard and loud, but the warmth never stayed. As soon as flames dropped, cold crept back in. Frost formed inside walls. Ice traced window frames. Floors stayed cold no matter how much wood went into the firebox. Families moved closer together. Beds shifted nearer to hearths. Rooms were abandoned to save heat. Cabins designed for space suddenly shrank to one livable corner. Outside woodpiles collapsed faster than expected. A week of extreme cold could erase months of preparation. Cutting more wasn't always possible. Snow buried fallen timber. Hands cracked and bled. Exhaustion slowed everything. This was when fear set in. Not panic, but calculation. Quiet conversations about whether the wood would last. Whether animals should be slaughtered early to reduce mouths to feed. Whether neighbors might need to share shelter. Winter wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. And then there was the small cabin. Smoke rose from its chimney, but not constantly. Thin wisps, short burns, no frantic feeding, no roaring flames visible through the cracks. It didn't announce struggle. That unsettled people more than failure would have. Because on the frontier, silence during winter usually means one of two things. Either someone has already lost or someone understands something everyone else doesn't. And as the cold deepened, more eyes began drifting toward that quiet cabin, wondering which one it was. When someone finally stepped inside the small cabin, the reaction wasn't disbelief. It was confusion. There was no roaring fire, no sparks snapping, no frantic heat pressed against one wall while the rest of the room stayed cold. The firebox held a modest flame calm and controlled more like a cooking fire than a survival blaze. Yet the air felt steady, not hot, not smoky, just warm everywhere. The kind of warmth that doesn't rush at you but settles in slowly and stays. The kind that doesn't fade the moment you step away from the fire. What people noticed first was the silence. No constant crackling, no drafts hissing through gaps, no sudden chills when the wind shifted. The cabin didn't fight the cold, it ignored it. The walls themselves were warm to the touch, not scorching, not cold, alive in a way wood never was. Heat radiated evenly from every surface, filling the space without forcing anyone to crowd near the fire. The floor wasn't frozen. The corners weren't dead zones. There was no warm side and cold side. This wasn't the sharp heat of flame. It was stored heat. The difference mattered more than anyone expected. Sharp heat fades fast. Stored heat lingers. It smooths out temperature swings. It lets the body relax instead of bracing. It allows sleep without waking every 2 hours to feed the fire. That's what unsettled experienced builders the most. They were used to working harder when winter intensified. More wood, more fire, more effort. This cabin did the opposite. It burned less as the cold deepened. Short, hot fires charged the stone. Then the structure did the rest. Warmth came from the building itself, not from constant labor. People stood inside and realized something uncomfortable. They had mistaken struggle for effectiveness. They had believed that exhaustion was proof of survival. But here was comfort achieved through restraint, not effort. This kind of warmth didn't demand attention. It freed it. And once that difference was felt, not explained, but felt, there was no unfeeling it. The idea that fire had to be constant, aggressive, and endless began to crack. Because this cabin wasn't warm by accident. It was warm by design. Opinions fade quickly when numbers enter the room. Up until that moment, the argument had been emotional. Some cabins felt warmer. Some burned less wood. Some people slept better than others. Those things could be explained away. Luck, weather shifts, personal tolerance. But once a thermometer appeared, excuses ran out. The reading was taken carefully, not near the fire, not near the door, 6 feet from the wall where people actually lived. The mercury climbed and settled, comfortable, stable, unmoving. Outside, the cold was brutal, the kind of cold that punished mistakes immediately. Breath froze, metal burned skin, wood cracked like gunfire. In neighboring cabins, fires were already roaring, eating through fuel with no guarantee of relief. Inside the small cabin, the fire was nearly out. That was the moment everything changed. The temperature inside remained steady long after the flames had faded. Minutes passed, then an hour, then several. The drop was minimal, barely noticeable. While other homes lost heat the instant a fire weakened, this one held on. The difference wasn't subtle, it was measurable. Builders who had trusted instinct over evidence stood quietly watching a number refuse to fall. Men who had spent decades cutting wood and feeding fires realized they had been solving the wrong problem the entire time. They had asked how to make more heat. This cabin answered a different question. How do you stop losing it? More measurements followed. Morning, evening, after a short fire, after no fire at all. The pattern stayed the same. Warmth lingered. The walls carried the load. The structure itself had become the heater. Once that truth was recorded, pride stopped mattering. Cold doesn't negotiate, and numbers don't lie. No amount of experience could argue with a stable temperature during a deep freeze. What had been dismissed as foolish now stood exposed as efficient. That single measurement did more than end a debate. It rewrote how people thought about shelter. Because when survival is at stake, belief bows to evidence. And winter once again had delivered its verdict. Once the numbers were clear, the question changed. It was no longer how the cabin worked. It was why no one else had been doing this already. The answer wasn't hidden. It had simply been ignored. Long before American settlers crossed the Rockies, people had been solving the same problem in harsher places. In northern Europe, mountain villages survived winters that lasted half the year. In alpine regions, fuel was scarce, forests were protected, and hauling wood uphill was a deadly waste of energy. In those environments, burning non-stop wasn't an option. Efficiency wasn't a preference, it was survival. So buildings evolved differently. Homes were compact. Walls were thick. Stone, clay, and earth were used deliberately, not for strength but for stability. Fireplaces were designed to heat masonry first, air second. The goal wasn't instant warmth. It was endurance through the night. The same logic appeared in places with no connection to Europe at all. Indigenous shelters across cold regions followed similar rules. Earth-covered lodges, semi-subterranean homes, thick walls, small openings. Different cultures, same solution. That wasn't coincidence. It was physics. Cold environments punish waste the same way everywhere. Heat behaves the same in Norway as it does in Montana. Stone absorbs energy slowly everywhere. Air leaks heat everywhere. Night lasts just as long. What separated these older designs from American frontier cabins wasn't intelligence. It was urgency. Settlers had come from places where fuel felt endless and winters were shorter. They carried assumptions that hadn't yet been challenged. Until now, this small cabin wasn't innovative because it invented something new. It was innovative because it reintroduced something old that had been filtered out by convenience and abundance. Frontier culture prized speed, build fast, move on, expand. Old world builders prized longevity, build once, endure, survive the worst year, not the average one. The winter had forced a comparison no one asked for, but everyone needed. And what became clear was this: the most reliable survival knowledge isn't loud. It doesn't advertise itself as progress. It waits quietly until conditions become unforgiving enough to prove it right. That's why this worked for centuries. Not because it was clever, but because it refused to fail when failure wasn't an option. Change on the frontier never arrived with announcements. It moved quietly, carried by observation and necessity. No one gathered to declare a new method superior. No pamphlets were printed. No one admitted they had been wrong out loud. Instead, people adjusted one decision at a time. The first changes were subtle. New cabins grew smaller, not dramatically but enough to notice. Walls became thicker, windows shrank, fireplaces shifted away from the center and toward corners where stone could be wrapped around them. Builders began talking less about how big a fire needed to be and more about how long warmth lasted after it burned down. No one called it a revolution. They called it being practical. Settlers who couldn't rebuild took smaller steps. Extra stone was added around existing fireplaces. Mud and clay layers were thickened. Drafts were sealed more carefully. Roof lines were lowered when repairs were made. Doors became heavier. People paid attention to where the wind came from and stopped pretending it didn't matter. The biggest change wasn't structural. It was mental. Wood was no longer treated as something to burn freely. It became something to protect. Families measured success by how slowly their piles disappeared, not how impressive their fires looked. Nights grew quieter. Sleep came easier. Less time was spent feeding flames and more time recovering strength. Builders began watching winter instead of fighting it. They noticed which houses stayed warm after storms, which cabins held heat through the night, which families didn't wake exhausted and brittle by February. Knowledge spread through conversation, not instruction. A comment here, a suggestion there. Try stone around the stove. Don't raise the ceiling so high. You don't need that many windows. No one credited the small cabin directly. That wasn't how pride worked, but its influence was everywhere. Frontier people are slow to change until survival demands it. Once it does, they change fast. What winter had exposed couldn't be unseen. Efficiency wasn't weakness. Restraint wasn't fear. Old ideas weren't obsolete. By the time spring arrived, cabins across the region looked different, not because of fashion, but because of memory. They were built with winter in mind now. The hardest lesson winter teaches is never about weather. It's about pride. On the frontier, confidence kept people moving forward. You had to believe you could handle what came next, or you wouldn't survive the work at all. But that same confidence became dangerous when it turned into certainty. When men stopped asking questions because they believed they already had the answers. That's what this winter exposed. The failure wasn't a lack of strength or effort. People worked hard. They cut wood until their hands split. They stayed awake through the night to keep fires alive. They endured. But endurance alone didn't make their cabins better. It just made the cost of bad design higher. The small cabin forced an uncomfortable realization. Working harder is not the same as working smarter. Many settlers didn't like that conclusion. It challenged a core belief of frontier life that survival was earned through toughness and persistence. But winter showed something else. Survival favored those who understood limits, those who respected how heat moves, how wind steals warmth, how materials behave over time. This wasn't about being old-fashioned or modern. It was about paying attention. People had dismissed older building methods as primitive because they looked simple. But simplicity was the result of refinement, not ignorance. Those designs had been stripped of waste over generations of failure. Every unnecessary feature had already been removed by winters far worse than this one. The frontier had assumed it was smarter than the past. Winter disagreed. That's the lesson no one enjoys learning, that progress doesn't always mean improvement, and tradition isn't the enemy of intelligence. Sometimes the most advanced solution is the one that has already survived the longest. The small cabin didn't win because it was clever. It won because it respected reality. And reality doesn't reward ego. It rewards accuracy. That truth stayed with the people who lived through that winter, not as a story they bragged about, but as a correction they carried forward, quietly adjusting how they built, planned, and prepared. Because on the frontier, arrogance isn't punished by argument. It's punished by cold. It's easy to treat this as a story from another time. Cabins made of stone, wood stoves, harsh winters without electricity. It all feels distant, but the core lesson hasn't aged at all. The tools have changed, but the physics haven't. Heat still escapes the same way. Wind still steals warmth the same way. And winter still punishes waste without mercy. Today we burn different fuel. We rely on grids instead of wood piles. Thermostats replace fire tending. But the mindset that caused the problem back then still shows up now. Bigger homes, higher ceilings, more glass, more energy spent chasing comfort instead of preserving it. The result is familiar. Rising costs, constant systems running, homes that feel warm only while energy is being actively forced into them. The moment that input stops, comfort disappears. Off-grid builders, homesteaders, and people returning to minimal living are rediscovering the same principles frontier settlers had to learn the hard way. Smaller spaces, tighter envelopes, thermal mass, orientation to wind and sun, designing for stability instead of excess. This isn't nostalgia, it's efficiency. The frontier lesson wasn't about living small for the sake of hardship. It was about removing what didn't serve survival, about letting materials do the work instead of people, about designing systems that keep working when effort stops. That's why this story matters. Not because one cabin was warmer than another, but because it proved something timeless. That intelligence isn't always loud. That tradition can outperform innovation when it's rooted in reality, and that the smartest structures don't demand constant attention. They hold. Winter still judges homes the same way it always has. It doesn't care how modern they are. It cares how well they manage heat effort and resources when conditions turn against them. The small cabin passed that test, and the lesson it left behind is simple, practical, and still useful today. Build less, waste less, understand more. That's frontier wisdom.